Hey everybody, it's Tom Davis back for another week of media ethics. It's hard to believe, but we're actually getting really close now as I check my computer. And it is actually February 9th, but we're actually closing in on actually the end of the readings. So believe it or not. Today I'll be talking about chapters 5 and 6. After talking about chapters 3 and 4 last week. And let's just kind of go over basically what we got to do here. Um, Okay, it's just taking a little while. I had a hard time actually getting this thing going. Okay, so I actually haven't set up everything yet. This is actually again the weekend. So this is your new discussion point. Are the media doing a good job developing sources? Does the media too often try to develop their own narrative? Meaning, basically, like it's kind of like the old putting words in somebody's mouth kind of logic. A lot of times the media are accused of basically instead of like really just kind of going out and doing a story and trying to find stories, they almost like kind of invent stories and just try to find ways to put the pieces of puzzle together by basically manipulating people and other things to basically say what they want to say and that sort of thing and fit a narrative, which kind of goes along with what we're discussing right now. Now, we again now we're going through the progression of basically discussing media ethics. We started at the macro stage of basically defining media ethics, and then we looked at different individuals, the philosophers, etc., the analysts, and how they define media ethics and how it applies to certain situations. And that's how we've been dealing with lately is how it applies to certain situations, like things like errors, how they're handled. Is it okay to make a mistake? Today we're going to be looking at transparency, okay, largely, and essentially manipulation, which will be kind of an extension of what we already talked about. Um, but anyway, so this will be the new discussion point. The last discussion point, as we speak, has not had a lot of people contributing, but that's fine because it's not done yet. It's not over. I'll do it on Monday, but basically we have here, you know, are there too many errors in journalism, and what consequences should journalists face themselves? Hannah, always the first to arrive. Thank you, Hannah. Many errors are made in journalism from casual blogs and tabloids are the most trusted news sources. Although these mistakes occur, I do not believe that there are too many, as journalists are only human and responsible to be 100% correct. Again, going back to the rubric, that's very good, substantial answer. I'm just really looking for people to participate in this. It's very good. And it's really your opinion. That's fine. I mean, it's not going to be published anywhere, but basically, how do you interpret um, the ethics, how ethics are applied to things like errors? Okay. Journalists flock to break the news before adversaries do. So, in today's media landscape, in this rush, we often see errors and misinformation. Yes, well, that goes to the news organizations probably trying to be first before being right. So, um, but anyway, so I appreciate the contributions to that discussion point. I actually have this in teacher view right now, so but whatever. It doesn't really matter either way. I mean, the midterm exam isn't until actually after the week after the spring break ends, and then of course you'll have a guide along before then to help you along. But today we're going to be talking about chapter 5 and 6, okay, which is due on February 13th, meaning Monday. Okay. And then all we got left is to talk about chapter 7, which we do on February 20th. And then chapters 8 and 9 on February 27th. But right now we're already halfway through the book, basically, 5 and 6. Okay. So let's talk about that. Yeah, some people ask me about like the price of this book. I didn't realize how expensive it was in some areas, but it is actually I got it pretty cheap on Amazon Kindle. I don't have the actual Kindle, but I have an app for on my phone and everything. Um so again, looking at the different chapters we have here, this is really kind of an extension of what we have here. It's actually transparency and faking the news, which is an extension, but we're going to go beyond what we've already talked about, which essentially was actually media manipulation and faking news, actually just really printing mistakes and lies. But going beyond that, and that's manipulation. Okay. Transparency, basically, that this chapter deals with the whole idea of um, the news organizations being open and honest about themselves, that they're human and they make mistakes, but do they actually do enough to actually correct those mistakes? And again, we've seen this a lot, like in the social media era. We've seen a lot of stuff that's been printed that basically isn't true, but there is like because there's so much that's diffused out there in terms of like media sources and everything. It's like how do you actually correct the record when it's not true? There's so much that like flows on Facebook that people believe, but how do you go back and correct that or change that, or do people even care about changing it? Um, Typically, the way to typically do it is this is as it says you're correcting the record. Corrections are usually the obvious and most painful way the media explain themselves to the public. Research suggests that readers respect such honesty. In national survey, 78% said corrections made them feel better. Okay, about half of the readers routinely check the corrections. I do that too. In the paper edition of New York Times, used to have like a big block. It's amazing number of errors the New York Times makes every day. It really is. It's like if you look at the paper edition, it's like a big block, like about maybe this big in the paper. Um, but what they typically do now, the good thing about the online media now is that you actually can put the correction at the bottom of the story, so it's right there. But that's often been a chief complaint, big complaint of people that after you make this mistake and the story is out there, you know, is it right to actually just like correct it with just like this little small correction? And this guy shows you Jason Blair. Should have called him up again. Um, and his stories again, he actually made up stuff, but his stories are still up there, even though they have mistakes in them and mistakes, they have lies. So I call it Wikipedia because Wikipedia is actually what have the actual links to his stories. And After Effects, the missing family waits. This was essentially as a story, I believe, that was plagiarized from another newspaper. It says editor's note appended, but it's not until the end of the story. So I don't know. Maybe you're slipping through, you don't even see this note. But all this is crap from someplace else, and I believe again this is plagiarized material. So I mean, but it's still up. And they put stuff at the end, and it's right at the end. Why isn't this at the top? I mean, that's often an ethical question that's asked. That when you make a mistake that, and it really, especially in this case, it affects the whole embodiment of the story. Like, why isn't it at the top? Because right now we're reading this whole story and we're reading a good story and we're manipulated to maybe almost believing the story, and suddenly at the bottom this. I mean, they did have the note at the beginning, but is that really enough? Okay. Um, Okay, so just kind of flipping through here, second guessing the coverage publicly. Um, you know, a lot has been talked about the Iraq War in the 2000s and how that was, basically how the media essentially was manipulated into that. I probably should have called that up actually. Um, and and how the media basically kind of played along, and it was interesting how it was manipulated by the Pentagon. It was they had this thing, and I was actually kind of almost well, I actually wrote a lot about like the after effects of it and people like suffering and stuff like that. To give myself credit, whatever. Let's see here. What would it be? Sympathetic. You spell sympathetic. Um, sympathetic. Sorry, this is probably really scintillating. Iraq coverage. Um, I mean, Operation Shock and Awe. I remember that was a big one, and they actually would. I mean, the camera's like far away. I remember that, and they were bombing, and there were probably people dying out of these bombs and stuff like that. There's been a lot been made about the media's failure. Um, you know, about covering that and basically kind of going along for the ride. And what we found out was, I mean, I think it's almost again universally believed now that that was a mistake going into Iraq. And a lot of people feel now it's a mistake going to Afghanistan based on what happened last year. So, um, and actually, maybe let's like go into this a little bit. It's gonna be a commercial first, I'm sure.
But if it doesn't pass, the president has left no doubt that he's ready to go to war. This is Fox News and Fox News Channel continuing coverage of the campaign which now has begun to liberate and disarm Iraq.
Liberate Iraq. Sure. I like Shepard Smith, but
Joining us now, Rajiv Chandrasekharan, senior correspondent and associate editor of the
anyway, so that was the thing that was like, it's not just like straight out mistakes, but basically like a narrative, framing the narrative, and then like coming around and basically second guessing yourself, which is what the media does now. They did not the newspapers, they got rid of them, but they have these people called ombudsmen. Should be ombuds people or something, but basically they have like essentially people who would actually basically serve as on the staff of news organizations, and they would actually do things like actually write stories within the news organization itself, basically looking at some of the coverage and that sort of thing, and basically like not necessarily correcting the record, but basically providing how maybe it could have been shaped better, if it could handle better, that whole sort of thing. It's interesting though. I think New York Times got rid of its ombudsman. Wasn't it nice? So I mean, I think that was actually a really good step that they had in basically addressing that and basically kind of like self-regulating their coverage, because the media does step into shit sometimes. Excuse me, it's YouTube for saying that. And and people are human, and sometimes it's not just a matter of just making a human mistake, but sometimes they get seduced, like they did in Iraq. Shock and awe, words like out of like some sort of WrestleMania or something like that. So Iraq has often been held up as a classic example of like, and we saw what happened there, like 5,000-10,000 dead Americans, many more Iraqis, the whole thing. We see like a country that's been essentially in chaos for a long time. So was that the actual appropriate way of handling it? And now 20 years later, we're looking at it and we're saying, oh my God, no. So I probably don't have like a ton to say here. It's good that there are many news sources out there. Fox News is often criticizing the liberal media, as they call it, that sort of thing. So, I mean, in one sense, maybe that's fair, because maybe it does go a little bit too far. But sometimes I feel like it's like its own manipulation, that basically they use that as a way to kind of sell themselves, as because the liberal media is something that's been a kind of like a conservative battle cry for a very long time. And you know what? And like I said before, there's actually some truth to that, I believe. I think the liberal media has been too liberal, and there are things that maybe people want to know about, maybe conservatives would be more interested in. That's just my personal opinion. There's been talk about maybe creating like news councils. Well, there are news organizations, like at Columbia University and places like that actually do things like write analysis and basically keep track of the things that are actually reported in the media. So all right, faking the news is kind of an extension of that, because basically we talked about that, and but it's interesting, like I said, it kind of goes beyond. You could argue that like shaping a narrative, faking a news, but there are times when like they go farther, and like and then actually, as I noted, like if I put things in yellow, it might be something that could be featured on the exam. But this again mentions the two top editors of the New York Times were brought down by the infamous doings of another wayward reporter, Jason Blair, as we talked about. Although low-level editors had concerns about his work, he continued to receive palm assignments, particularly for such a young reporter. Then the truth came out. Times investigators compiled an amazing list of journalistic frauds that Blair had committed. In a front-page story, the paper admitted he had filed dispatches from Maryland, Texas, other states when he was in New York, fabricated comments, blah, blah, blah. So in that sense, they actually had like if you look at it like a typical newspaper, they actually had like a 2-page big paper newspaper of all the mistakes he made, and they actually basically dedicated almost like a whole paper to it. But was that enough when you start seeing things that are actually appearing there still on the internet? It's a good question. Okay. What was interesting about this story here, this is always often held up as like the classic example of media being media seduction into a story that it was just too. I mean, it was a horrible theme, but too good to be true in a way, the way it was written. It's a totally made up story. Janet Cook had written a story about Jimmy's World, 8-year-old heroin addict who lives for a fix. And it was interesting because it's the kind of thing, one thing you should know is that there's not a lot of like self-governance within the news organization itself. You have the ombudsman, but what about editors, that sort of thing? We saw that with Jason Blair and how they just kind of trusted him and just kind of let him do his thing. But you should know that there's actually not a lot of actually a high level of editing going on in a newspaper itself, especially now with like all the cutbacks and everything. There's a lot. And when I was at Patch, we didn't even really have copy editors. I mean, we did the best we could to like actually edit our stories. A lot of those stories, probably a good maybe a third of them to more of them, didn't get edited at all. So we would like I would do like quick looks at them and things like that, maybe the top stories, but we just didn't have that ability to do that. So a lot of things are slipping through nowadays. But even back in the day when I mean, at my organization right now, Best Review, we actually I almost feel like we have too many editors, but still not enough. And right now I'm doing actually a layout production, and and so anyway, and we have like editors right now who are looking at we have editors right now that like look at things, but we still find things like in that. Well, we have 3 editors look at every story, and we look at them, and I'm the first one to look at stuff, and then like I won't catch something that like won't come, down the pike. And we really just caught something. They put in the wrong data. We were doing a story because it's about insurance, about death benefits, and they put in a graphic about the rise in death benefits in recent years um because of COVID. But we just discovered because of an editor who had a hinkling, she said, for it, that it actually wasn't death benefits in this graphic that they had, the statistics. It was actually just benefits in general. Imagine if that got through. My God. So sometimes it just takes, that's why you need like this levels of editing to check things and make sure that everything is correct. So anyway, this kind of thing, actually, even with all the editors at the Washington Post at the time, which is probably more than we had, um, um, and actually, I'm gonna have to just stop for 1 second. Okay, sorry about that. Anyway, so let me just go back to where I was. So anyway, this was a story basically like it was, like I said, it was just almost like too good to be true. And this was actually soon after the Washington Post had actually broken the Watergate scandal to help bring down Richard Nixon, the president of the United States, in the early 70s, late 60s. So they were really riding on a high, they were basically becoming the paper of record in the United States, and then suddenly this happens. And it was interesting listening to Ben Bradley, the famous editor who was featured in the movie All the President's Men, um, talk about and basically like kind of self-regulating and basically admitting to the mistake, which really warranted. They got a Pulitzer Prize for this thing. This is the kind of thing that you like to see more than just a little box or paragraph, basically people being humble and showing humility about the mistakes they made.
Janet Cook. Yeah, I've heard about her too. Worst moment in your professional life. Sure. You find out that you have been had, and your paper's been had. Yeah, been lied to. Your credibility is at stake. Yeah, and people you believed in have been fooled, like Bob Woodward, Coleman, and others. Well, devastating blow, because you were turned in by one of your own. You were seduced by the fact she was too good to be true. I wanted that story to be true. But you were seduced by her because she was too good to be true. African American, she had a great academic background. She could write like a angel. Yeah, I wanted that story to be true. You wanted her to be true too. I mean, it wasn't just the story. Yeah, but I had satisfied that one. I'd hired her, and she had done some really good stories. So in a moment of great judgment, Bradley's instincts failed him. No argument. And almost risked the reputation of the paper, except for the fact that you said, well, we're going to get it all out. I said, if I learned anything in Washington, I have learned that if you are the victim of a scandal, you better come clean. There is only one damage control, and that's the truth. Yeah. And you get it out. And I must say that in that dark moment, I was very proud of that. We and Bill Green, who was the ombudsman who did that extraordinary 10,000 pages, 10,000 words in the Washington Post. He told everything.
There was nothing that's come out since. So that, boom, there it was. We returned the thing. We returned the prize. I called Joe Pulitzer up the night before and said, it's coming back. And he said, oh, no, that's just, it'll blow over.
You don't think much of Pulitzers, do you?
I'd rather have them than not have them.
But come on.
There you go. Anyway. So that's something he apologized up until he died, which was probably about 5 or 6 years ago, 7 years ago, maybe. Anyway, so that was a gross example of basically media manipulation and seduction. Of course, sometimes the media actually takes it upon themselves to seduce people and manipulate. And it's interesting, like you hear about quotations and basically making sure that you basically don't want to quote people out of context. The whole argument over cleaning up inarticulate comments, that's actually interesting because it's often argued that it's actually fine to actually clean up inarticulate comments because you're trying to connect with the world. But you don't want to make up a quote. So there is like a line there somewhere, and you have to find it where it is, and basically find it based on your own personal gut check beliefs. Remember from the Potter's box. But there is one area where it's really been especially manipulated. It's the world of photos. Staging the news. And it was interesting because I've had to deal with this personally with certain people. One reason people watch TV news so that they can see events as they happen. Newspaper readers also want photographs that capture the event. Sometimes this demand for pictures pushes the media into ethical quicksand. Newspaper photographers often engage in a benign form of staging the news. They may ask people to pretend to be talking on the telephone or engage in some activity. That's something I had one photographer I thought went a little too far. He was trying to get people. We were doing a story at the beginning of this century, right? And then we're writing about the last century, and he was writing about the Wright brothers, and he was trying to get people to walk by the Wright brothers plane. And I felt like, you didn't really have to go that far, but I've seen people go all the way on the other end where they have people walk up and down a beach and they say, keep walking, pretend that you care, or whatever, that sort of thing. And we see that actually a lot of TV footage and that sort of thing. Where you'll see people kind of looking at something or something like that. It's often staged and often it's very artificial, Many journalists want the public to believe that the pictures, sounds, and video they use are accurate depictions of the news. But the sad truth is that phony pictures have been around for a long time. In the rough and tumble days of the 30s, newspaper photographers carried props and like stuffed bears, broken dolls, that sort of thing. There's a couple of examples where maybe and I've actually had people bring this up and obviously plagiarism isn't a good thing. They brought this up in their all presentations, and that is the manipulation of photographs. And there's a couple of classic examples of that, where maybe you could argue that it was a good thing, and then maybe it was a bad thing. Let's first show maybe where it was a good thing. This was a very famous photo from the Kent State massacre during the Vietnam War in Ohio, where they shot protesters and other people and killed them, the Ohio National Guard. And here was a woman, I believe she was 14 years old, believe it or not. And so right here you have a poll that was right here. And what happened was when they actually released this photograph to the news, a lot of news organizations actually took that poll out. As you can see, this is before the days of Adobe Photoshop. This is 1970, or I believe 1971, 70. So anyway, you could argue, I believe that was actually a fair thing to do, because by leaving in the poll, it looks like the poll is actually coming out of her head. And that almost makes the photo, I hate to say, some people derelicts might actually laugh at that or something like that when you have this right here. And it takes attention away from what is supposed to be the news right here. So I would argue that maybe is a fair manipulation of art, okay, for news, that sort of thing. What you don't want is where it maybe changes the entire meaning of the photo. And there's probably no more classic example than this Iraq war photo right here, where a photographer, I think this photographer actually was fired for this. This is the photo he or she came up with right here. basically showing, look, I mean, the soldier's stopping him from taking care of his children, that sort of thing. When actually it was like two photos. Okay, right here was actually this man right here, and then it actually had his gun down when the man was facing him. And what he did is he combined the two and made this to kind of show some sort of struggle or show the United States actually like coming down on people for carrying their children or something. That actually completely changes the meaning of the photo. So that I would argue is you're going too far. And we've seen like media be tricked by that scenario, or maybe like a photo was produced. We've had situations like that. I remember during Hurricane or Superstorm Sandy, where they showed like things that were actually not actually as bad as really destroyed as they were, but they wanted to show destruction, that sort of thing. So we actually had to really like deal a lot with like, trying to get people on the right track and make sure that we actually were using legitimate photos. And that's a hard thing to do, because you have to actually like really look at the photos, you have to verify the photos. And that's not, and verification, I gotta tell you, is not easy to do. You have to actually go to the photographer itself, and maybe sometimes you almost have to actually look at their camera or something. And since the internet became a thing in 1995 and 6, it's become like the Wild West, so basically trying to regulate that kind of thing. And then you also have to deal with things like people often like reproduce photos or put them on social media, or even reprint them from the internet when they don't belong to them and that sort of thing. That's copyright infringement. And a lot of actually photographers actually have gone back, a lot of laid off photographers too, who are basically are pissed off about it, and gone back to going to those places that have actually reprinted their photos and basically sued them for a ton of money, because that's wrong and they shouldn't be doing that. That's stealing. Okay. All right, so you have your new discussion point. You have your new chapter to read, chapter 7, and after that we have 8 and 9. Okay, all leading up to the midterm exam. And again, remember, I'm actually checking and making sure, keeping track of who's doing discussion points. Make sure to read the rubric, where everything is basically discussed there and how it's applied in terms of like participation, which is a big part of our grade first half of the semester. All right. So thanks very much, everybody, and I will talk to you.